passion for video games is certainly not something we're in short supply of, but what happens when that passion is allowed to run wild, free, and untamed? Well, you get exactly what we have right now, collections with a lot of games and games that have gotten expensive. Thing is, most people in the hobby of collecting retro games are of the age where nobody can tell them what to do, and what it is we want to do is collect video games. I mean, what else are we going to spend our disposable income on? Video games are awesome. When we were kids, unless we were spoiled, there was likely a limit put on how many video games we had by our parents. Well, look at me now, Dad. We really showed them, didn't we? But as annoying as it might have been to have our collections be limited, it may have taught us some valuable things, like appreciating what you have seems kind of important, but hold on a second, you might be thinking. You can still appreciate your games even if you have a lot of them, right? Absolutely, but problem is, not everybody does. Now look, I'm not here to tell anybody how they should or shouldn't collect. There's a million different ways to do it, and ultimately it comes down to each individual collector being happy with their own personal collection. But unfortunately, this isn't always as easy as it should be because many of us feel pressure from the collecting culture that exists around us, and this can manifest itself in a lot of nasty ways. Feeling like you need to own certain games, feeling like you need to own certain consoles, feeling like you need to own a certain amount of games for certain consoles. I only own one game for my PSP. You think I deserve to sleep at night? I can't even sneak in day naps. The PSP guilts the heck out of me. Not to mention that sometimes simply owning certain games isn't enough. You need to make sure you've played and really like that game too. There's a special place for people who don't like Chrono Trigger. For some of the higher profile games, people can feel like their collections are flawed without it, even if it's a game they're not into, and that doesn't seem right. I see the term must-have games getting thrown around a lot, and that's always seemed a bit dramatic to me. Typically, if you must do something, there are consequences for not, like I must go to the bathroom or I'm going to poop my pants. If you miss a game, trust me, you'll be fine. Now, you might say, well, must-have game is just a way of sounding enthusiastic. It doesn't mean you actually must have that game, except that when some people see the term must-have game, they end up feeling like they must have that game. So perhaps it's not the best phrase to use. Some of the best suggestions for games that I see almost always have the recommendation be conditional in some way. For example, there's a good chance you're going to love Final Fantasy Tactics if you're a fan of strategy RPGs. Or if you like bananas, then there's a good chance you'll like bananas. Now that seems fair enough, right? Okay, but let's talk about the juicy stuff. That's right, how many games you have in your collection. Oh, there's a bunch of games behind me? I had no idea. This is just where I happen to like to hang out. We love to talk about adding games to our collection too, which makes sense. You're enthusiastic about games you just picked up and you want to share that excitement with the community. But what ends up happening is that when we see so much of people showing huge stacks of games they own, the idea of owning a ton of games just feels very accepted. And not that it shouldn't be, but it also shouldn't feel like that's what you need in order to be a collector. Adding games to your collection is fun, I get it. A video called Games I Got Rid Of isn't exactly exciting, but sometimes getting rid of games can feel good. Having less can allow you to focus more on whatever is left. Although, you could get rid of a game that you end up regretting later on. Anybody ever rebuy a game before? Whoops. I think there's definitely a huge fear of missing out when it comes to games. You don't want to get rid of something because what if you want to play it down the road at some point? I mean, you never know when the mood will hit you, and if the game is no longer in your collection, you can only blame yourself. Plus, if you get rid of a game now and want to get it again later, by that point the price could be out of reach. Fear of missing out, of course, also applies to adding games. You buy some games that you're not even necessarily in the mood to play at the time you buy them, just to secure that you have it. And what's the rationalization for this? Every collector's bread and butter, the magical phrase of I'll get to it later. Well, it's later and you still haven't gotten to it. No, you didn't mean later, you meant like later. Well, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but at some point we do die, and I'll play it later isn't going to do the trick then. What's unfortunate about having more games as an adult is that we also have far less free time than we had as kids. So, depending on how many games you have, it might be unrealistic to think you can actually play all of them, which is obviously problematic if you're somebody who's bothered by the idea of games just sitting on a shelf. But what are they supposed to do? Stand? And what if you actually are okay with not getting around to every game in your collection? The best way I've seen this rationalized is that a collection can be thought of like a library. Nobody ever says, yeah, I'd been enjoying my local library, but then I stopped because I finished it. The idea is to have a lot to choose from. I can see where somebody is coming from with that, although I'd argue that it really doesn't take much to have more than enough to play. I mean, if you think back to when we were kids and most of us had way more free time and way less games, we were still always playing something and enjoying ourselves. And even in some of the rare cases where maybe we would have been bored with them, it probably would have only taken just a couple more games to keep us satiated. I think that if somebody wants to have more games to choose from, then more power to them, but we should be more accepting of people who have less games. You don't need to have a ton of games to have a ton of passion for gaming and get a ton of enjoyment out of it. It always breaks my heart a little bit when I see people feeling like they have to give some sort of a disclaimer about the number of games they have, either for a particular console or overall because they're worried they'll be judged for it not being a lot. I just don't understand why some people would think they're better than others for having more games. I mean, isn't that on the short list of things everyone knows not to do? Who are these monsters? I've even seen somebody apologize before. That's right, apologize for only having 20-something games for a console. That's not something to apologize for. Eating an entire bag of french fries at 2 a.m. when I was planning to share them with my wife the next day, that's something to apologize for. As kids, if we had more than 20 games for any given console, that would have been considered a gold mine. And we often only ever had about one console at a time, too. If you only have a few games, you gotta own it and rock those few games. I mean, just check out Super Retro Bird here. One confident dude only owns one game, but do you think anybody thinks he's a failure because he goes home to Sparkster at night? I think a glass half full mindset is helpful here. Appreciate the games we have instead of longing for the ones we don't, because there's always going to be games you don't have, and the games we already have can certainly always use more appreciation. I mean, goodness forbid we play some of our games at all, let alone multiple times. Alright, but now we have to talk about the money aspect when it comes to games, which is a bummer but hard to ignore. I mean, you need it to buy games. If only you could pay for games with smiles. What'll these buy me? People having difficulty getting into the hobby because the prices create a barrier is certainly not ideal. People will point to the market being manipulated in various ways, which has always been a problem to various degrees for as long as games have had value, and there has really not been much we've been able to do to stop it, unfortunately. One thing I'd suggest is that if you are going to go the old consolidation route, or just sell games from time to time, try to give the games to somebody you know is passionate about them. That way they'll be in good hands. Luckily, one of the more positive aspects surrounding collecting culture that's been picking up more and more is all the alternative methods that make gaming more convenient, affordable, and just easier overall. Devices like the Raspberry Pi, Mister, the mini consoles, so on and so forth, are allowing for more people to get into the hobby without putting as much of a strain on the available supply of original games from back in the day. Yeah, not everybody is after your copy of Samba de Amigo, although maybe they should be. Fun game. But choices are always a good thing, and personalizing your collection, or whatever you use to play games, gives everyone a better chance to have a happier, healthier relationship with the hobby, which has always been the ultimate goal as far as I'm concerned, so don't worry about what other people think. After all, nobody ever cares as much about a collection as whoever the person is that owns it. Most people I've ever shown my collection to barely care about it at all, let alone anywhere near how much I do. But with all of that said, I'm sure a lot of you have some thoughts to share, of which I'd love to hear. And remember, you're talking about your fellow retro gamers here, so be kind to each other. For those thoughts and anything else you'd like to say, leave a comment and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah, and he's talking about video games.